For several years now, your work seems to have focused specifically on the regulation of cannabis. What's your position on other illicit substances? Are you also in favor of regulation for other substances like methamphetamine, I don't know, heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, things like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as I said before, I think we need to decriminalize possession and the mere consumption of any type of drug. Like, for example, what has been done in Portugal 20 years ago. This is a very essential decision as a society to not punish people for the mere consumption of whatever drug they like to take. Because by punishing people for consumption, we actually give them some kind of extra luggage for the rest of their life. We give them a criminal record, which makes it much more difficult for them to find a job, to find a house, etc., to integrate in society.
And it's also basic personal freedom.
Yes, also, but we are giving people a kind of a handicap if we criminalize and punish people for the mere consumption of a pleasurable substance. Now, about regulating and legalizing and regulating other drugs than cannabis, on a theoretical level, of course, I have the same arguments. Yes. Any drug that we keep in the illegality, any drug that we criminalize in terms of production and supply, we have the same problems. And so cocaine is more dangerous nowadays than it should be when it would be legally produced. Heroin nowadays is more adulterated, contains more impurities, etc., than when it is produced by a pharmaceutical company. So there are very similar arguments. Of course, we also have to take into account the objective risks and toxicity and inherent risks of each of these products in terms of physical dependence, and psychological dependence, etc. And for me, the most logic system would be that we rank all these drugs in terms of dangerosity or riskiness or toxicity, and that those drugs that are the most dangerous are legalized but have a very low degree of legal access. And that those drugs that are less risky, less dangerous, can be more freely regulated, so that the degree of restrictions becomes higher as the drug becomes more dangerous. If we would do that with alcohol, it means that legal access to alcohol should be very restricted, because alcohol is always classified as one of the most dangerous and most poisonous drugs that we know. Now, of course, this is not very realistic. So, what I would like to see is that we start regulating with those substances that are the least dangerous and who are more prevalent in our societies. And that's why we end up with cannabis, because cannabis is on those, in that hierarchy of dangerousness is quite low. And it's also 80-85% of all the illegal drug consumption relates to the consumption of cannabis. So it really makes sense, pragmatic sense, to start with regulating cannabis, because it's the most prevalent illegal drug and it's not one of the most risky ones. Yes. And from there, we can take it in steps, in phases, to start thinking about regulating other drugs that may be more dangerous.
What would be just next to cannabis?
Well, there are already working groups and scientists working on scenarios on how to regulate MDMA, for example, and psilocybin and LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs. There are actually already scenarios on the table on how to regulate cocaine. And
you mean worldwide?
Yes, or it's a theoretical model how you could regulate cocaine. And even with those very dangerous drugs, we have to keep in mind that most of the dangerous drugs that we know are pharmaceutical drugs. They are already legal. They are already produced by pharmaceutical companies. Many of these drugs have a history of being created by the pharmaceutical industry and then later on become popular illegal drugs. So we have pharmaceutical companies already producing opiates. We have pharmaceutical companies already producing derivatives of cocaine. Our dentist is using certain products that are related to cocaine. So it's not unthinkable that pharmaceutical companies produce these kind of drugs. Now, in terms of regulation, of course, to make the access to these dangerous drugs too unrestricted would not be a wise thing. So in the models, for example, on cocaine regulation, the proposal is to kind of allow legal access to cocaine, which is produced by pharmaceutical companies, on prescription of a specialized addiction doctor. So this means that an 18-year-old who has never tasted cocaine cannot just go to the pharmacy or to the dispensary to get his legal doses of cocaine, but people who are already under treatment, who are already known to be regular cocaine users and addicted to cocaine, could go into these projects and get their cocaine legally prescribed. I do think it's an interesting hypothesis because the Swiss experience with heroin was very interesting in that sense. In the 90s, you had an enormous heroin problem in Switzerland, and there were open drug markets and parks, Needle Park in Zurich, where hundreds and thousands of people were publicly injecting dirty heroin. So the health crisis was enormous. They kind of solved it, or were able to manage the problem and to turn it back into kind of acceptable phenomena by medicalizing the heroin and by inviting those people to register for heroin prescription programs. So the people formerly injecting heroin in the parks with dirty needles were now sent to centers where they were prescribed heroin, which was produced by pharmaceutical companies and where they were supervised by doctors, making it actually also much less rock and roll and glamorous and to be a heroin addict. Now they had to go to centers with doctors in white jackets and nurses overseeing their injections and stuff like that. And so basically they managed to take the rock and roll to a certain extent out of heroin consumption and to bring those people from the parks where they were actually dying from overdoses and all kinds of terrible transferable diseases, etc., back into the treatment system. And this was by kind of legally prescribing heroin to people with severe heroin problems. So if that's possible, and we are doing that in other countries as well, if that's possible, there is maybe a model to legalize cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine for certain groups that are now doing it, underground and in a very dangerous way, and to turn it into something much more manageable, much more controllable, and also more healthy.
Okay, but I can see the intention, of course, but take cocaine, for instance, which is widely available and widely used recreationally by many people. If you restrict access too much and you put too many conditions for its access, will this reduce the black market in the way that's desired?
That's a difficult point because it's true that it will always be a very complex balancing point between how much access you give through legal channels and whether those channels of access are enough to cover the whole population or the whole group that wants to use or is using. It's true that if you regulate cannabis in a very, very restrictive way, with a lot of administrative barriers and stuff like that, the black market will still be an option for many people. So this is a very different balancing act which is never finished. It's the same thing with tobacco. We have to keep in mind that trying to nudge consumption patterns downwards is a very difficult exercise. We had a lot of trouble trying to do that with tobacco. Finally, we're seeing the statistics evolving in the right direction. Legalization is not a miracle solution. It's not a panacea. First of all, we have to keep in mind that whether we legalize or not, whatever the legal framework, people will continue using pleasurable substances, and they have many reasons to do so. So whatever we do, even if we legalize and regulate the market, there will always be consumption. Secondly, as a society, we will always face problems of dependence and addiction, because we will always have a certain percentage or a certain group of people who use too much, too frequently, who get dependent or use drugs as a coping mechanism for personal problems, like personal trauma or personal misery or personal pain. Or people who use drugs as a coping mechanism for social problems, for being excluded from society, etc. So even if you legalize and regulate a drug, you will have consumption, and you will have people who become addicted to that substance. What this is about is whether we want a policy that, apart from the dangers and the risks of drug use and addiction, also creates extra problems and extra damage, or whether we want a policy that just focuses on the damage of the drugs and tries to reduce that. In the policy of today, we are creating extra problems, extra damage, extra risks, and legalizing and regulating the drug market is about being able to focus on reducing the risks that result from drug use. So even when you regulate the market, we will always face drug problems, but we will be more able to tackle them efficiently.